Imagine that Hephaestus came with his tools and stood over them as they were lying together and asked, "What is it you humans want from each other?" And when they were unable to reply, suppose he asked them instead, "Do you want to be so thoroughly together that you're never at any time apart? If that's what you want, I'd be glad to weld you together, to fuse you into a single person instead of being two separate people, so that during your lifetime as a single person, the two of you share a single life. And then, when you die as a single person, not as two separate people, and you share a single death. Think about it. Is this your heart's desire?"
Ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho, ho-ri-o-ho-ho.
Hello and welcome to the Spouter-Inn. This time we're going to be looking at Plato Symposium. It is a cold and wintry day outside, but we've got some cats here. We don't have any wine.
We have tea.
We have tea, which is a drink, but it's perhaps not as exciting as what the people will be talking about, will be imbibing as they communicate to each other.
Yeah, I'm excited to be talking about the symposium today. We're going to be using Robin Waterfield's translation, but there are others you could look at if you're interested in the text. And it's a drinking party, and I can't imagine a more unusual setting to talk about philosophy, but maybe we'll feel differently once we get to the end.
Absolutely. And there'll be a link to that translation, of course, in our show notes. But first, we have a little follow-up already from our first episode, the last episode we did about the Iliad.
Yeah. Shema Boyarin wrote in to say, he wrote, "I couldn't help thinking based on your conversation, what are the implications of situating a poem that is so much about war and its impact on people, men, women, children, as one of the formative literary texts of Western literature? He asks, what does it mean to start the story of literature from this point?"
That is a really great question. And I have a bunch of thoughts about that, and I'm sure you do too. But obviously, I want to start off by saying, we picked a text. In fact, we tried to pick three texts, this whole cluster of three texts as being very formative texts. That is sort of an arbitrary entry point. So I don't want to make too big a deal. I don't want to go off the deep end and say, war is literature or anything like that. But that is still a really interesting conversation to think about. Why is this text about war so compelling? Now, we talked about last time some of the ways in which, although it is a text about war, and although it does depict battles, it is about what happens after war, what happens during war, what happens because of war. And it really looks into, I think, some of the traumas of war, some of the ways that affects relationships, the ways that it affects lives. And those are the kinds of big feelings that we often want to communicate to other people. We want to remember when they happen, and that we want to seek fellow feeling when we are feeling overwhelmed by these feelings or the potential for those kinds of feelings. And that's some of the sort of psychological reasons why literature has always been made and consumed.
Yeah. Like there's so much in what you're saying right there, like the extent to which it would be, first of all, this whole question of Western tradition. I think there's an awful lot for us to say about that, but I'm going to bracket that and put it over here for the moment. I want to pick up first on the arbitrariness of what we've chosen. It's not like we're saying these are the books that give us the world we have now. No, these are a few books you could look at together and they would tell you something interesting, but also they would make you feel in interesting ways, both about our sense of the past and also our sense of ourselves and the world we're in. And when you were saying about, it's not so much that we're interested in the world of war. What we're interested in is people who are put in situations that press something out of them. That's going to be true in the symposium as well, right? Even though it's a dialogue, right? It's supposed to be about philosophy. It's supposed to be intellectual. People get cornered at certain moments or moved at certain moments or pressured at certain moments. And what comes out is extraordinary.
Also, I think we could say that one of the reasons why we pick these texts are that they have sort of been agreed upon by the tradition and history and culture that precede us as being fundamental. And there might be something to the idea of thinking about the Iliad as a war text, as a text that is meant to be taught to and to help train young men with the expectation that they will be glorious in war and whose benefit that serves. And that's there, and that's the thing that we can think about and we should think about. But you don't have to necessarily think about that. There are other approaches into the text. There are other ways in. And I think I don't want to go so far as to saying that approaching it from another angle is queering the text necessarily. But nevertheless, these are capacious texts that allow for many different readings.
Yeah, you look at it from the other side, there's a sense in which we can say the Iliad's about war. We can also say it's about love. We talked a lot about the emotional connections that are binding people together and fear for your beloved, right? And in the same way, when we're talking about the symposium, the ostensible topic of the symposium is love. That's what the people in the symposium will be talking about while they're at their drinking party. But it's also got a very dark underneath that's concerned with conflict and war and death, all the things that the writer and the reader of the work, the symposium, knows are going to happen, that are lying just beyond the end of the text itself. So these texts have more than one side to them.
Absolutely. Well, before we get into the symposium proper, I'd also like to give a quick shout out to another bookish podcast here on the network, Dear Reader, which is a monthly check-in with two old bookish friends talking about what they've been reading lately and so forth. In the second episode, which just came out, Michael and Emily discussed two recent adaptations of some Homeric myths, in particular Margaret Atwood's Penelopiad and Madeline Miller's Circe, which I think pair nicely with our discussion of the Iliad last time. They also bring up some of the Achilles, Patroclus business as well. So if you're interested, check that out. Suzanne, I believe you've been reading Circe recently as well.
Yeah, I got it for a gift not too long ago, and I was just dipping into it. And I don't want to get digressive about that, but there's an awful lot to say about books that are responding to other books. And the Penelopiad and Circe are both, modern responses to Homeric texts. But there's also a really long history of that. You can even think of Joyce's Ulysses. We might talk about that sometime. What does it mean to very deliberately and consciously write around or add on to or write alongside a text that a lot of people already know? That might be something we want to think about together another time.
Absolutely. Well, you can find that episode at megaphonic.fm/reader/2. We'll put a link in our show notes, but I think it's about time that we turn our attention to Plato's Symposium.
So, Chris, I know that the Symposium, like the Iliad, is a text that we both taught together some years ago. What do you remember about it? What stands out in your mind when you think about the Symposium?
So the Symposium is, of course, by Plato, a very early foundational philosopher in the ancient Greek tradition. This is coming a couple hundred years after Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. This is about 300 BCE?
Yeah, thereabouts, closer to 400 BC, I think, if I remember correctly. We should check this.
Historians are no good at dates.
But it's a few hundred years. It's definitely 400 years apart. Yeah, so it's like around 400. I think it's 385. The crucial thing I think that is useful is it's a few hundred years after Homer's written the Iliad. So it's a book that these people know.
Yes.
So Plato himself, but also the people who are talking.
So Plato is particularly interesting as an early philosopher because his texts don't look like what we tend to think about philosophy texts looking like. They are presented generally as dialogues, and some of the earlier texts in particular get very literary and dramatic in how they deploy these dialogues while still having a lot of room for interesting ideas thrown back and forth between interlocutors. The Symposium, I believe, is early to middle in how we think about his development as a writer. His later texts get very, very, very dry by the end of his life, and he becomes much more hardcore philosophy. But there are still so many literary elements in a text like the Symposium that it can be read for literary pleasure as well as to take a philosophical interest in the question, which is, what's love? Like, what is that all about? This takes place over the course of a symposium, which means a drinking party. Literally, that's what drinking together is how that translates. And a bunch of people are gathered over at some fabulous rich guy's house. They've all had a hard night of drinking the night before, and they're going to have a measured night of drinking tonight is their plan. And they're going to each do a speech praising love. Because as they say, nobody ever praises love. That's just not a topic that comes up very often in philosophy or literature, which is curious. You then have several people each taking turns giving their speeches with a bit of back and forth in between. And then it concludes with, it seems like it's going to conclude with Socrates' speech at the end of this. But then after that, there's a big surprise when another guest bursts into the scene and changes everything up. Alcibiades, who pretty bad boy of Athens, shows up. Drunk as all get out.
Flowers in his hair,
completely trashed, takes over the party, gets incredibly freaked out that Socrates is there because Socrates is the only person in Athens who could resist Alcibiades' come-ons, it seems. And then this plays out into a final heated debate about the nature of passion and love before the person who is informing us about this story passes out from all the drunken revelry. It's a weird
it's so
text.
Weird. Yeah. No, I think you've hit on some of the most important points. You were saying that the Symposium is a kind of a literary text, even though they're philosophical aspects, and Plato's later dialogues are more dry and more philosophical. And I think I don't know. I feel like it's important to say it's not like he writes more literary things and then he straightens up and writes serious philosophical things. The Symposium is a text that's very, very luscious. It's playful and beautiful and kind of bewildering. But it is also, I think, deeply philosophical. There are real questions here. There's a real hard backbone to the text at the same time. So it's philosophical, it's literary, even poetic, vivid, but also dramatic. Right? It's a dialogue, but not just and there are moments where there really is dialogue, a crisp back and forth between characters. It's a group of people. They're all together, and sometimes unexpected things happen. So it looks, in some ways, very highly structured. There's a series of speeches and then 6 speeches, and then there's that interruption that takes it to another level. But there's also all these very contingent moments, unexpected things, not just Alcibiades busting in, but there's a moment that happens when one of the people at the Symposium, Aristophanes, is supposed to give his encomium, give his speech about love, but he's got the hiccups, so he can't go. So the other guy has to go, and then it comes back to him. And it's a weird effect.
Well, we should get right into talking about the text. What did you want to talk about first? There is a lot to this text, after all.
There are so many things to say about it. You remember when we were talking about the Iliad, one thing we emphasized was that you can just read from the beginning and go on reading, but another way of doing it is sort of dip in, come in at the middle, or even almost randomly. With the Symposium, it's a little bit harder to do that because there's a real sense of sequence. Even though there's that slightly chaotic quality that we were just talking about, there's a sense that it's helpful to see how one speech gives way to another, and then also to be set up for Alcibiades busting in, drunk and beautiful near the end. But that said, there's also this very strange kind of opening to the text. It's a story that somebody's told to somebody else, and we're getting it in this very highly mediated way. That's something we might come back to a little later. I think probably a really useful thing to do is to sort of lay out exactly what kind of environment these people find themselves in. We've said already it's a symposium, which literally means, as you said, drinking together. It's a drinking party, but a drinking party with a difference. It starts out the regular kind of way. We're hearing a story about something that happened some years ago, a party. And Socrates was on his way to this party, and he ran into a friend of his, Aristodemus, and said, "Oh, come with me. I'm going to this party at Agathon's house." So they go there, but Socrates, as is his way, kind of gets distracted. He's like, easily distractible, it looks like, and dawdles. And Aristodemus goes on ahead to the party. And Agathon's like, "Oh, it's great that you're here. I was going to invite you anyway. Come on in. Where's Socrates?" And so Agathon wants to find Socrates and bring him in. And so this happens. Agathon sent a slave to go and look for Socrates and bring him in, and suggested that Aristodemus share Eryximachus's couch at the party. A slave washed him so that he could take his place on the couch, and then another slave came in with news of Socrates.
So yeah, we've got slaves.
Yeah, this is a world of slaves. We don't hear about them a lot. We hear about them a little bit at the outset. They show up again when Alcibiades busts into the party, and Agathon says to one of the slaves, "Take off Alcibiades' shoes for him," like because he's too drunk, presumably, to take off his own shoes. And so there's these couple of moments where we remember that this is a little bubble, a very rarefied bubble of an elite group of people within a larger world. And we might say, yeah, sure, like many societies have slaves, but it's almost a sense that there's a world of bodies and a world of minds, right? And the slaves are part of the world of bodies, I think. That's right at the edges and shows up again within some of the things people say in the course of the symposium. So where the body is in this, I think, is something that shows up in odd moments.
Yeah, the slaves are there to, it seems, tend to some of the bodily needs, cleaning and the removal of shoes, and as I think we might discuss, I believe they're there they're there to be sexually available as well.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Whatever you need.
Whatever you need, and to bring in the food and to pour the wine. And that can be contrasted with the upper class elites of this society who are there to nourish the mind or to have a drinking game to nourish the mind. But of course, these people also have bodies. They're not disembodied in any way. They're there to get drunk. They're there to feel their bodily, and they're constantly aware of how
they get hiccups,
how drunk they are, how they get hiccups, and then dealing with or talking about sexual desire, needs, wants, and refusal of those needs and wants. There's a real sense that these people are totally embodied while thinking about non-bodily things. If we want to think about that dichotomy more.
Paradoxically, the way in which they talk about the most rarefied and most disembodied things, the highest ascent of the mind, it brings them right back to talking about bodies. Because in the course of the speeches, one of the speeches we might talk about a little bit more is when Socrates is talking about how he, always the teacher, in this particular case was the learner from a person called Diotima, and she uses this metaphor of pregnancy to talk about knowledge. And that might seem really weird to us and counterintuitive. So at the very moment when you're talking about the most abstract kind of learning, the most abstract kind of, I don't know, spiritual mental experience, it's corporeal, at least metaphorically.
Absolutely. But it's also been corporeal along the way. One of the most well-known speeches from this text is by Aristophanes, the comic poet, who tells a story of the origin of love, in which there are basically pairs of people originally were fused together physically as one, and they were cleft apart. And love is the desire for those cleft apart couples to come back together. It's very much the sense that love is a physical lack. It's because of a physical separation that happened to you that you're trying to undo.
Yeah, and not just happened to you, happened to us. Yeah.
Yes.
So there's the sequence of speeches on love, right? They're at the party. Usually you have the slaves playing music, doing whatever you need in the way of entertainment. But at this drinking party, they're going to do something a little bit different. They're going to each give a speech in order, going around the room, couch to couch, right? Where everybody's sort of lying on their couches, drinking, having delicious snacks, right? And they decide also that they're not going to get super drunk all at once, right? They're going to drink in a measured kind of way. So they're just drunk enough, right? So just drunk enough to enjoy themselves, to, have a really pleasurable time, but to keep going, to have kind of an endurance, which is, I think, interesting. And there's a sequence of speeches. One person, Phaedrus, talks about the origins of love and the relationship of the lover and the beloved and how that should be, ideally, he says. Another one, Pausanias, talks about there being two different kinds of love. There's a doctor there, Eryximachus, who talks about the idea of moderation, drawing on sort of medical ideas of how the body should be in balance. And then you get the story of Aristophanes. And like we said before, he's supposed to go earlier based on the order of the couches in the room, but he has hiccups, so he can't go. But when he finally tells his story, it's an origin story, or almost like a myth, which he's making up. It's comic, but it's also playful, and it's kind of, I think people have found it deeply moving. This story about how humanity, at an early point, we had male and female natures, and then they were wrested apart from one another, and then put back together, sort of backwards, right? So we are always looking for our other half. We're always looking for our counterpart. And on the one hand, this story of Aristophanes is part of a very ancient world, very alien to us, very weird. That notion really persists in our contemporary culture, right? This idea of your better half, right? We hear that cliche, right? Finding the one. That story of Aristophanes shows us that kind of fantasy, or I don't know, fantasy, that belief has existed for a long, long time. And he describes it in terms of being a part that wants to be a whole. And that, I think, is something that many of us have felt, right? Even if we might maybe a little bit more cynically or more wisely, I'm not sure which one, say, oh, well, that's just a silly belief. I don't think there are many of us who haven't felt it, this sense of yearning for it to be complete, to be whole.
It's an explanatory tale that allows you to put voice to some of your feelings in the moment. But like so many explanatory tales, it can take on a little too much weight sometimes. It can sometimes be something that you have to let go when you realize that isn't quite satisfactory, that that you have met somebody and you feel full for a moment, but maybe you don't still feel full after a while, or maybe there isn't just the one, or maybe you realize you don't need anyone, or maybe there are other possibilities, but nevertheless you may still have felt a period in your life where that tale makes sense.
Yeah.
And it is one of the interesting things about this text, about the Symposium, that a lot of these ideas do feel like ideas you can sort of pick up and then cast off when they're no longer as useful for you. That seems to be built into the structure of this repeating different ways of thinking about the same thing.
I think that's exactly right. This whole question of specifically the kind of thing that Aristophanes talks about, if you're in a couple, are you a part or are you a whole? Are you part of the two, or are you a whole being in yourself, right? Those are obviously both true in different ways. And on the one hand, we're talking about love, we're talking about human beings' emotions, but that's a philosophical problem also. And that's one of the ways in which the Symposium keeps us balanced, I think. We're teetering between the realm of the intellectual and the realm of the emotional or the affective. And as you were saying too, it would be easy to imagine that these speeches as they go along are a kind of ascent. Each time we're getting to a better and more reliable account of love. Now, this is going to be the right account, whether it's Aristophanes or when we get to Socrates' account, this is going to be the right one. But I don't think that's right. I think it's more like a spectrum of possibilities. And one of them is going to seem more right to you at different moments.
It'll be interesting to talk about how the text feels about that. But I think that is, as a reader, that is definitely also how I would walk away from this text.
Especially because Socrates, when he speaks, when it's his turn for a speech, he's going to do a lot of weird things. One of the things he's going to do is not start right away with a story in the same way that Aristophanes did. He's going to start out almost in a debate mode or a dialogue mode with a back and forth, a very crisp back and forth with their host, Agathon. And that's kind of interesting because the tone of that back and forth, it's crisp, it's funny, is very different from what we get in the story he tells about his encounter with Diotima, and how Socrates, who we're accustomed to seeing in this particular text, but also throughout Plato's writing as the teacher, right? The person that Plato, right, is looking up to all along. We see him at the feet of someone he's learning from.
So we've skipped over poor Agathon's speech, which is not terribly memorable, I don't think.
It's very pretty.
It's very pretty. It's very pretty. After the delight and the vividness of Aristophanes' speech, you get this little interlude of prettiness before you get on to Socrates' much more rigorous, perhaps rigorous.
Which is super mean, right? Because Agathon was a writer of tragedies, and the occasion for the drinking party is actually he's the host of this drinking party because he just won the big drama competition, right? So there's a kind of, how can I put it? This is a text that has this universal quality, you could argue, right? That it speaks to, if not everyone, it could speak to almost anyone on some ground. But it's also part of this very specific coterie world where I get the sense there's a certain amount of kind of in jokes, you have to be in the environment to understand exactly what the interactions are. So that Agathon gives a speech that's pretty, but you read it and you're like,
Similarly, I believe this was written after Aristophanes' play that pokes a bit of fun at Socrates, the clouds, right? Would have been performed.
Yeah.
So this is informed by this beef.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So let's talk first about the dialogue portion of Socrates' speech, and then we can move on to the Diotima bit.
Yeah. Is this something that struck you? One of the things that I really enjoy about the symposium is like the incredibly clever yet rude way Socrates behaves at different moments. I just find this super charming, right? And I think one of the reasons why that works so well is you get the impression from figures like Alcibiades that they too find Socrates both incredibly irritating and incredibly charming. And so to be drawn into that as a reader makes you feel like you too are kind of on some level a little bit in love with Socrates.
Absolutely. I think this is common in a lot of the Socratic dialogues that Plato wrote, where people want to test their mettle a bit against Socrates in these kinds of dialogues where they often know that they will end up being humiliated.
They always lose.
Of course they always lose. That's very important. But nevertheless, that's part of the appeal of it is what is he going to do next? How is it going to play out this time? What crazy trap am I going to fall for in his logic? And the idea that you'd have to walk away from this and really think about what just happened and figure out where it all went wrong is part of the joy of interacting with Socrates, it seems.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. There are a couple of moments where that comes out really beautifully. One moment, as I said, is before Socrates launches into his account, his speech on love and his account of his experience with Diotima. But another example of just that kind of character shows up when Socrates first arrives at the party and Agathon has welcomed him. And I'm just going to read a couple of lines that I think kind of capture this personality. Is near the beginning of the work. Socrates sat down and said, "Wouldn't it be nice if wisdom was like that, Agathon? Imagine if it could flow by contact from one who had more of it into someone who had less of it. It would be like water flowing along wool from a fuller cup into an emptier one. If wisdom is like that, I think it's very important for me to share your couch, since I'm sure I'll get lots of excellent wisdom from you until I'm full up. I mean, my wisdom is insignificant, whereas yours is brilliant." And Agathon says, "You do treat people brutally, Socrates." He's being really polite, but Agathon's like, yeah, no.
I think a lot of people have made a lot about Socrates' position of, well, I don't know anything, that I am ignorant, and therefore that's my approach. Yeah. But it is an incredibly catty thing to say if you're well known. Yeah,
they all know this about him, right? And and one of the other places this happens is that back and forth before he tells the story. And so there's this weird dynamic, right, where Socrates on the one hand is engaging with people intellectually, right? There's an argument, but it's not just that he wins the argument. I mean, none of us find it, how can I put it? Probably the most annoying thing in the world is somebody who always wins every argument, right? I hate that, right? I think we all hate that. But Socrates does it in a very charming way and in a way that involves your emotions as well as your intellect. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's such a different mode of engagement. When people talk about Socratic dialogue or Socratic questioning or the Socratic method in teaching, there's a lot to say about that. It is good to ask questions to draw out knowledge from people, right? But to do it in this way that involves your emotions as well as your intellect, really hard to do well, right?
Absolutely. And often in this dialogue and in a lot of other Socratic dialogues, you reach the point in the dialogue where the person that Socrates is speaking to is only allowed to say, yes, very much so. Indeed, Socrates.
Yeah.
That is true.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting both from a philosophical sense, where in your Penguin editions or whatever of these texts, there will often be a lot of footnotes talking about all of the not quite solid arguments that Socrates is deploying right now. Why this logic isn't really as strong as the interlocutors make it sound.
You're meant to notice that.
Yeah.
Those are not accidents, right? You're meant to notice that there are flaws. Right?
Right.
And you might think, well, why is that?
But there's also the sort of psychological sense where very often it feels like whoever Socrates is talking to is just worn down at this point.
Oh, yeah.
Where they're just like, okay, let's just see where this is going. I'm just going to agree and follow this train. I don't have to fight to figure out what exactly was wrong with it. I'm just going to say yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a strange dynamic.
Did you want to read some of that dialogue?
Well, should we? I think it's kind of cool. Do you want to do it as a back and forth?
Sure,
or do you want, okay.
sure.
Do you want to be Socrates or do you want to be Agathon?
I'll be Agathon.
Okay. So this is in the middle of a longer argument. It follows, says Socrates, that love needs and lacks beauty.
Inevitably.
Well, would you say that something which lacks beauty and is entirely without beauty is attractive?
Of course not.
This is how things stand then. Do you still maintain that love is attractive?
It rather looks as though I didn't know what I was talking about before, Socrates.
And yet you still gave an attractive speech, Agathon. But I've got one more little question for you. Don't you think that anything good is also attractive?
Yes, I do.
So if love is lacking in attractive qualities, and if good things are attractive, then love lacks good qualities too.
I can't refute you, Socrates, so I dare say you're right.
No, it's the truth that you can't refute, my dear Agathon. Socrates is a pushover.
Oh, boy.
What a bitch, right?
Seriously. Who invited him?
Well, I know, but this is the thing, right? They clearly find him troublesome, right? In all kinds of ways, and yet absorbing. And when Alcibiades busts in at the end, as we're going to discuss, he gives voice to that experience, that troublesomeness of Socrates, because he's attracted to him, as you say, partly because Socrates is the only person who can't resist his charms, partly because he's just troubled in a way that they're all a bit troubled, I think, by Socrates.
Well, let's get to the second half of Socrates' speech, where we introduce another speaker who isn't there.
Yeah, Diotima. Yeah, what do you think about that? I have a lot of feelings about that whole feelings about the scene, but also feelings about the way it gets talked about in the scholarship. What do you think about it?
Well, I haven't read as much of the scholarship.
I haven't read that much either.
So I can only imagine it's discussed poorly.
Well, what they do is they say things like, well, yes, there's evidence that she was a historical person, but clearly she's just a mouthpiece for Plato. And I'm like, we could say that about Socrates.
Absolutely.
How can I put it? I am suspicious of the rush to assume that it is inconceivable that there is some kind of intellectual and emotional lineage to the kinds of things that come out in Socrates' oral teachings and then show up in Plato's written dialogues, right? But bracketing that, irritation, right? It's a really neat moment, like I said, because Socrates is the teacher. He's the person who's always in a position of authority, and he's just done that, beating Agathon into a corner here. But now he's showing himself as the learner. He's describing himself as the learner. And that has an interesting effect on the people who hear him, right? Because it's not that it takes away his authority, but it lets you know that you go from one position to another. So it tells you something about maybe where you will go.
Well, how do you mean?
Well, Socrates talks about his encounter with Diotima, and Diotima explaining to him about a model of how love can work, about how when you experience love for another person, let's say you admire their physical beauty, you're attracted to them, they turn you on. She says you go from that to admiring the things that they do, to admiring the things that they think. I'm going to read a couple of lines. This is Diotima talking. I got to put it. This is what Diotima said, as reported by Socrates, as reported in the conversation of the symposium, right?
As then reported by
reported by person
we
after
are
person.
Several layers deep.
We are deep. It's like an onion
here.
here. But anyway, but these are Diotima's words being reported, right, through a whole series of people. She says, okay, so you admire a person's physical beauty, you admire the things they do, you admire their mind. And then she says, this in turn leaves the lover with no choice but to look at what makes people's activities attractive, so that he comes to regard physical beauty as unimportant. Then he presses on until he sees the beauty in the things people know. Now he has beauty before his eyes in abundance. And then she says this. No longer a paltry and small-minded slave, he faces instead the vast sea of beauty, and in gazing upon it, his boundless love of knowledge becomes the medium in which he gives birth to plenty of beautiful, expansive reasoning and thinking, until he gains enough energy and bulk there to catch sight of a unique kind of knowledge whose natural object is the kind of beauty I will now describe. Try as hard as you can to pay attention now, she said, because a person like this will suddenly catch sight of something of unbelievable beauty. It's a strange moment, isn't it?
Yeah.
The part I think I love most there is when she says, try as hard as you can to pay attention now. You get the sense, like, not that this is just something really important, but like you're on a threshold. Like you could almost see this thing. And the fact that it's Socrates recounting having heard somebody say these things to him gives you the sense that he was once on this kind of threshold. And if you ever feel like you're kind of on the threshold of understanding, this is somewhere he's been. So it's a very strange, I don't know what to call it, a strange set of relationships that we're inhabiting there when we hear Diotima saying, pay as hard as you can. Try as hard as you can now to pay attention.
The other thing I always think about with this section is that this is the first speech where you have somebody really bringing in another person into their discussion of love.
That's true.
Where in both halves, both he's having this dialogue with Agathon, and then he's remembering a dialogue that he had with Diotima. And this connection between the dialogue, the pair of people coming together to become pregnant with ideas, to have some sort of something come out of their conversation back and forth. Although the other speakers talk about couples, they don't involve other people the way that Socrates does.
Yeah, you've said a bunch of interesting things there. And one of the things you've said is that there is a kind of similarity here to the account we get from Diotima via Socrates to what we heard from Aristophanes. Aristophanes gave us the sense that there are two people that come together, and it is impossible to totally satisfy that yearning, right? There are two people that are always striving to be one person as they were at the beginning of time. Here too, there's this coming together of two people, but it's a very different kind of dynamic in a number of ways, but in particular in that it's generative. There's something that comes out of it. And it's not like physical babies, right? It's intellectual babies, right? Or it's things that grow out of the medium. And we might want to think about that. Like, what does that mean for another person to be your medium, the thing out of which other things grow? Is that a kind of, I don't know, parasitic or exploitative relationship? Or is it a relationship of mutual growth? And this is something that Diotima unpacks to a certain extent in Socrates' account of their encounter. But it's something that I think we're left with a feeling that we need to think about it more and play it out in our own minds. What might that look like? What would it be like to bear emotional, intellectual progeny with others? And is that something that only happens between two people, or is that something that is also communal in certain occasions? Diotima never talks about that. Plato is always, things are always in twos, right?
Well, they are, but I mean, one of the other interesting things about this is that you have this sense of Socrates and Diotima, so a man and a woman in this case, getting together, and whether there is a traditional romantic sexualized pairing or not, there's nevertheless this idea that they have come together and gotten pregnant with something, fulfilling this coupling, this kind of intellectual, emotional coupling. And that has also just happened between Socrates and Agathon, and is happening throughout everybody who's participating in the symposium. But in particular, this coupling between Socrates and Agathon, which Alcibiades will later more strongly suggest is more traditionally flirty and romantic or sexualized or whatever, however you want to phrase that. I mean, one of the interesting things about that is that it sort of pushes back against Aristophanes' tale. It introduces the possibility of bisexuality or some other forms of other possibilities come out of this.
Yeah, both in Aristophanes' account and also in the account of Socrates, we get a lot to think about in terms of how gender is playing into this whole question of engagement. Right? On the one hand, you could see it as very like heteronormative in the sense that there's this whole sense of one person who's active, one person who's passive. There's a source of inspiration or whatever it is, and a medium. There's always that balanced pairing. But within that dynamic, whether we're talking about men or women, that part of it seems to be very much separate from that two-part relation that underlies other aspects of being. So that's interesting and worth thinking about some more.
Yeah, and even if it seems to be falling back upon heteronormative models of pregnancy, for example, it's nevertheless suggesting that pregnancy isn't tied to sexual generation. It isn't tied to the gender of the participants.
No.
It isn't. It's just like pregnancy. You need to think of pregnancy more widely, and then it suddenly is this very capacious way of understanding how people interact with each other.
Yeah, which I think is really neat. I mean, I remember the first time I read the Symposium, that really blew my mind. I was really excited by it.
Absolutely.
So one of the things, we've talked about Alcibiades quite a bit. Like he's beautiful, he's drunk, he's got flowers and ribbons in his hair, he busts in. And we've said already that he's really drawn to Socrates. And one of the things that I find really interesting, and tell me what you think about this, what is it that Alcibiades sees in Socrates? It is partly just that Socrates can resist him. I mean, that's a huge aphrodisiac, right? But there's something else. He keeps talking about what's inside Socrates, which is uses very strange language to talk about that.
Do you have some of that on hand?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. It does it a couple different times early on in his speech and also later on. In other words, everybody else has been giving speeches about love, but what Alcibiades does is he gives a speech about Socrates. And he keeps saying he's like a Silenus, which is a kind of a nested doll, a little bit like these sort of nesting Russian Matryoshka dolls that you see sometimes, right? Where there's like little things inside of it, right? Like rather than many little dolls. Anyway, so Alcibiades says this. He says, this, that is Socrates outside, this is just an outer coating, like the outside shell of those carved Silenus figures. But if he were opened up, you'd find him chock full of self-control inside. And then a little later on, he says, I don't know if any of you have seen the genuine Socrates opened up to reveal the effigies he has inside. But I saw them once, and they struck me as divine. And then he comes back to this again later on. There are these effigies, these forms, these little things inside of Socrates. He says this about Socrates. Again, this is close to the end of what Alcibiades has to say. He says, his conversations are just like these Sileni you can open up. The first time a person lets himself listen to one of Socrates' arguments, it sounds ridiculous. But if you could see them opened up, if you can get through to what's under the surface, what you'll find inside is that his arguments are the only ones that make sense. Under the surface, his arguments abound with divinity and effigies of goodness. So sometimes, like early on, he's talking about Socrates, but then he's talking about Socrates' arguments and this idea of an outside that looks one way and an inside that looks different. That seems to me really interesting and important. Like he knows there's something there, but he doesn't know what exactly. And that's part of what makes him both attracted to Socrates, but also I think really angry. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
He seems really unsatisfied and frustrated.
I think, at least in some of the traditions, Socrates is not meant to be a traditionally physically attractive man. Right?
No.
So Alcibiades, who is the hottie of Athens, why is he so obsessed with this person who is not the sort of person who he should be obsessed with? So he is the younger, more attractive person. He should be the beloved.
Absolutely.
Socrates should be coming after him. And yet this role reversal has happened. And now he's chasing after this unattractive old man.
Yeah.
Because there's just something about him that is tantalizing to him.
Yeah. And so it's a reversal, right? That's playful in a certain, I think we're meant to understand that it's playful and comic in a certain kind of way. And there's a lot you could say about that. But we're also meant to be asking ourselves, what is it that attracts us? What is it that draws us in?
The other interesting thing about this is that Alcibiades saw these effigies inside of Socrates one night when he managed to get Socrates into his home, managed to get Socrates into the bedroom, managed to get him into the bed, managed to get him under the covers and snuggled real tight, and Socrates still would not put out. Mm-hmm. In a way, he's gone through all of the processes that Diotima explains. He was attracted. He maybe not physically attracted, but nevertheless, there was something there that there was some physical desire into him that led to him seeing some aspect of the divine because he was paying very hard attention at some point and trying to get into his toga, so to speak. But nevertheless, that led him to appreciate this more divine aspect of love or of desire or of what you might see in somebody that you could appreciate that isn't just the physical beauty and the physical act.
Yeah. Well, the divine, he says that.
Yeah, so it's interesting that this comes after in the discussion, because we've had this theoretical discussion of how the Diotima's approach to thinking about and then letting go of different aspects of normative desire and love might lead you to a higher plane of a more abstracted beauty. And then and then you see, no, this is exactly what happened. He didn't even, Alcibiades didn't even hear the story of Diotima, and yet he's
doing it.
He's done it. He's been there. It's happened to him. And he's ruined.
Yeah. Well, he hasn't, and I think I've been thinking about this lately. Like, I haven't taught this text for a few years now, but I was thinking about this lately. What is it that we know that the people at the symposium don't know? What we know is what happened to Alcibiades after, which was political ruin and disgrace. Historically, what happens is Alcibiades is involved in a failed military campaign down in Syracuse in Sicily, and he ends up in disgrace, and he ends up fleeing to Sparta, where they're the sworn enemies of the Athenians, right? So at the time that the narrative of the symposium takes place, that is the recounting of what happened at the party takes place, Alcibiades has already been disgraced. So he's a very strange figure at this moment, right? Because he's admirable, he's beautiful, everyone adores him, but also for the people who are telling the story, he's been disgraced. So we are invited to kind of think about, were the seeds of his downfall already kind of there? Was there something wrong there already? And then we might think about, how does that affect that whole encounter with Socrates? Could he progress in a meaningful way in that love? We're left wondering about him. We're left uncertain. And that's one of the reasons why the text is kind of neat. It looks really different every time you come back to it because of those ambiguities.
So as we've been saying, there's a lot going on in this text in terms of the big picture discussions about love, but there's also a lot of little business every so often. We've also mentioned this, of course, but we start out with this frame narrative, which picks up in the middle of a conversation between two people. It starts off as a sort of normal Socratic dialogue. When we see Socratic dialogues now that they're published, you get indications for who is speaking what line, as if it were a play. That's not how they were written down. That's not how they're handed to us, but that is how they're presented on the page. In this one, I believe I can't remember the name of the actual person who's doing most of the talking in this dialogue, but his interlocutor gets like 2 lines.
Yeah.
If that.
Yeah. It's super weird, right? So when we begin the text, we're hearing Apollodorus, right? He's the person who's telling the story. And it starts right in the middle of things. I think it's like the most bewildering first page I've ever seen in any work, right? It starts out like this. It's Apollodorus. He says, I think I'm quite an expert in what you're asking about. I mean, just the other day, somebody asked me about this. And you're like, what? It's the weirdest thing. And so Glaucon, who's the person he's talking to, has asked him a question. He gets like 2 lines. So Apollodorus is talking to Glaucon. Glaucon's like, I heard about this really neat party. Do you know anything about it? And Apollodorus is like, oh yeah, I can tell you about this. But it did not happen recently. It happened a really long time ago. And I heard about it from somebody who was at the party. So he's telling about a party that he wasn't even at. He was a kid when that party happened, but he heard about it from somebody else, and he checked on some of the details with Socrates later on. And the person who was at the party, who told the story, was himself drunk. I mean, he talks about near the end how, like, I passed out. I don't know what happened after that, but in the morning it was like this. And at another moment, he's like, there were a few more speeches. I don't really remember them.
Yeah. He skips the boring bits, which is delightful.
Well, yeah. I mean, it sounds like if you've never looked at the Symposium, you might be like, oh, this sounds like an incredibly complicated work. It must be incredibly hard. It's really short and it's sweet and it's charming. But the more you think about it, though, you're like, there's this web of connection that invites you to try to tease it apart. And if you do read it, don't be put off by that opening, because you're meant to be like, what? You're meant to be bewildered, I think, by the ways in which the story's been passed on person to person to person.
Yeah, I don't know whether we believe, by we I mean people who are scholars in this, believe that there are a few lines missing at the beginning of it, or if this is how it was intended to begin.
Well, yeah, who knows, right?
It doesn't really matter for our purposes as readers. Like, that's what we get. That's how we start. And it's abrupt and it's intriguing. Also, we never come back to the frame narrative.
No.
It doesn't end with Glaucon saying, that was really interesting.
Yeah, great story. Thanks. Right? No, but I mean, we can't know if it was intentional or unintentional to start that way, but there is something that gets said by Aristophanes right before he tells that really powerful origin story. He says something that, I don't know, makes me wonder. He says this. He says, what I'm going to do, says Aristophanes, is to try to introduce you to love's power, and then you can pass the message on to others. And that makes me think that, that's such a turning point in the story that it makes me think that, we are invited to be thinking about how stories get passed on, how knowledge gets passed on from person to person, whether it's Diotima to Socrates, whether it's these people who are telling the story in the opening.
Yes, and perhaps you could say that that kind of transmission of story is also a way of impregnating.
Yeah. Well, that's it, right? I mean, it's not like we get the exact original story. We get the impression it made on somebody and the impression it made on somebody else. So it's passed through the medium, right? It's passed through the beautiful medium, right? One time after another.
Becoming perhaps more refined along the way
or becoming different.
Not. Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think that's the thing, right? Other things are born. Like the way we're talking about the text right now and the impression it made on us, this is not necessarily going to be the same that it looked, I don't know, to another kind of reader, to somebody 100 years ago, to somebody 500 years ago. It looks really different at different times, right? It becomes something different in a different medium.
There's also an interesting bit at the end, what they're discussing after I've already forgotten his name. The person who's at the party who told the person who is telling Glaucon about it.
Aristodemus. He's the one who was at the party.
Okay.
Right? Yeah.
So he falls asleep. And when he wakes up, what's being discussed by the handful of people who are left, including Socrates, is the nature of tragedy versus comedy. So what is playwriting about? And there's a line, Socrates was trying to get them to agree that knowing how to compose comedies and knowing how to compose tragedies must combine in a single person. And there's this weird sense of like, well, is this just a weird way of trying to describe what we've just read?
Yeah.
This comic and tragic tale. I mean, it's not fully tragic. It's not fully comic. It's this
but
weird
it has
middle
both of these things, yeah.
In terms of what the actual play is like, what the experience of reading it is like. In a sense, it's Plato trying to show off that, like, look, I can do a little of this, I can do a little of that. And I've invented this whole new genre of a philosophical play as well.
Yeah, or that it will look to you in a different way. It's like if you were to hold up a sort of a beautiful object, right, and look at it from this side and from this side and from this side. On the one hand, it's a dialogue. On the one hand, it's philosophical. On the one hand, it's poetic almost. It's very literary. It's also perhaps a play, a drama, right? We have a number of characters who are all inhabiting very different kinds of roles, not just saying different things, but speaking in different kinds of ways. There's the drama of Alcibiades coming in almost like the god Dionysus himself, So on the one hand, it's a play. On the one hand, it's a philosophical dialogue. On the one hand, it's a piece of literature, depending on how you're looking at it.
You've got a bunch of drunk people being very catty with each other at various points. It's a bit, Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf or Boys in the Band or one of those kinds of things where people just get a bit cutthroat at times.
Absolutely.
While also trying to maintain their decorum. It doesn't completely fall apart like it does in those pieces, but nevertheless, there's some good cattiness. You could imagine different ways of staging this.
Yeah, that would be amazing.
None of which would be using this as an actual script because in the actual text, there's just one person saying almost everything, just describing all these different people. Other Platonic dialogues, yes, you have characters. Some of them are a bit thin. Some of them are just there to agree with Socrates. But this one, which has the most drama, is actually only being said by one person, which is so weird.
Well, it's almost as though you can imagine it staged two different ways simultaneously, right? Where it's one person who's just sort of telling this whole story years later, or you can imagine it being this scene of drunken revelry and catty conversations, right? In terms of staging it, that would be just like incredibly cool to imagine having it be almost parallel in that kind of way, where there's that potentiality that's underneath the voice of one single person. But certainly we're being invited to think about it as a play. I mean, the fact that it's a party at Agathon's house where he's celebrating his triumph in the drama competition, the fact that we end up with this conversation that Socrates is having with the others about tragedy and comedy, we're definitely being invited to think about it as a drama, regardless of this question of performance. And that's kind of neat to think through. I mean, if somebody were to stage it, it would be a beautiful offspring.
It would be very interesting. And again, Plato offers enough stuff for them to do that it is not just long speeches. It is long speeches, but it's got a bit of business in between. It's got hiccups and it's got little remarks about who wants to get with who and interactions with the slaves and another round of drinking. And it reminds me of the movie My Dinner with Andre.
Yeah.
A friend of mine made an edit of that in which he cut out all the dialogue.
It's so weird.
This is a movie of two people having a dinner together and talking about philosophy and art and so forth. It's very much in the style of the Symposium in many ways. But you cut out all the spoken bits and you end up with this like 15-minute long movie which mostly consists of a waiter bringing food.
Oh, wow.
And it suddenly changes how you think about the physicality and the placement of the movie. I mean, the waiter becomes a much more significant character, but actually there is some interesting tension and drama emerging out of how the waiter is dealing with it, how they respond over the course of their conversation to more food coming along.
Well, I mean, it invites us to think about and not fail to notice the extent to which even when we think we're most in the life of the mind, we're always in the life of the body, right? We've talked about the possibility of doing a cluster of books sometime that are talking about feasting or food. And I think that might be a really neat chance to come back to some of these ideas.
Well, before we wrap up, any final thoughts about the symposium? Do you have a favorite speech?
Oh, that's hard. I think my favorite speech has changed a lot over time. There was a period when I was absolutely taken by Diotima's words to Socrates and this idea of a kind of ascent and this idea of like intellectual pregnancy. I was really taken by that. And I think all of us have been captivated by Aristophanes' account of the origins of human beings and charmed by that. The last little while, I find myself more and more responsive to some of the parts about Alcibiades where he's so frustrated, right? He's looking for something but doesn't quite know exactly what it is, and is drawn to it. So I feel like it's a text that on the one hand I think about intellectually. I can lecture on in a very sort of structured kind of way, but can also, when we talk about it in this more unstructured way, this more personal way, I find that it's always opening itself up in different, often confusing kinds of ways. Almost the more I know about it and the better I know it, the more questions I have, the more uncertain I am. And I think you don't have that happen with very many books, but it's a book that always does that to me.
Yeah, I agree. I think the first time that I was reading it, the Aristophanes legend was particularly exciting. The fact that my understanding is that this is the only explicit mention of female same-sex love / physical relationships in classical literature or in ancient Greek literature, anyways, which is remarkable, and it's fantastic to see it there, and for it to not be a big deal.
No one seems to bat an eye.
So that's always great. And the first couple of times I read it, it was all about sort of those big stories and the philosophy of it. But I think as I've read it more and more, I have gotten really interested in some of these smaller details about what's going on between the people, what's going on between the speeches, and Alcibiades' entrance and the kinds of charges he makes and how he changes the room.
Yeah.
Even though there aren't a tremendous amount of opportunities to see reactions to him, there are a few, I believe.
You feel it.
Yeah, you feel it. You just feel it. Like, this is not the same kind of conversations we were having a few minutes ago.
He's so emotional. He's so passionate.
Yeah,
right. It feels very different.
It does, and it's interesting to think about what that means in a philosophical sense, what that means in terms of, I guess we're all familiar with that in terms of somebody crashing a party and changing the vibe. But then philosophically, what is that? What is that changing the vibe moment?
I think we're meant to feel it as like the divine. Alcibiades is going to talk about his attraction to Socrates in terms of the divine, these divine qualities that are inside Socrates that he knows are there and he can't quite get his hands on. But I think we're meant to feel it also as what happens when the divine bumps into your world. I mean, you may have these means of intellectual ascent, you may have these philosophical capacities, but the divine bumps into your world. And this is in some ways very, very different from the world we saw in the Iliad, but there is some common ground. We talked about Hector, for example, having a clear sense of what lay ahead of him, what he had to do, and then Athena just turns that all upside down. The gods bump into your world in ways that you have absolutely no control over, and you only really recognize once it's happened.
Well, that I think leads very nicely into what we're going to be reading next time, which is Ovid's Metamorphoses.
Yeah. And in some ways, it's, it makes sense as the third of this first cluster in the sense that we're also talking about a work from the ancient world, but it's a very different kind of text in a lot of different ways. I mean, it's part of a Latin tradition as opposed to a Greek tradition. And for me, one of the big, big differences, and this might be something we talk about more next time, it's a text, I'm a medievalist, right? So I mostly work on the Middle Ages. And so I didn't read things like the Iliad or the Symposium until relatively late in life because they didn't have those books in the Middle Ages. They have versions of the Troy story, but they don't have the Iliad. It comes back in the 15th century, or 14th century, right? But starts spreading in the 15th century. In the Symposium, they get back again in the 15th century, even though they know Plato, other works of Plato very well, and he's really important in the Middle Ages. So they're texts that I came to very late. The Metamorphoses, by contrast, is a text that gets read over and over and over again in the Middle Ages. So for me, teasing it apart from its reception, it's a very different task. So I feel like for me anyways, we'll be talking about it in a slightly different kind of way.
We'll get into this more next time, but do you think of the Metamorphoses as a more medieval text?
Well, it's a very different kind of text. I think, like the Iliad, it's a text that really lends itself to dipping into. It's really long. Fine to read the whole thing if anybody's interested in doing that, but also totally fine to just pick up randomly and read a bit of it, because while there is an overall structure to it, and maybe we'll say something about that next time, it's made of lots of little pieces. And so just pulling out a little piece here and there is a really good reading experience.
If people want to do a little bit of homework and read up for next time, is there a particular edition that you're going to recommend?
Well, this is, I think, difficult because I don't know of a modern one that I like a lot. I find them all kind of frustrating one way or the other. I know you and I have talked about this in the past. I think the one that we both like the most is not a modern translation at all.
No, but that might be a bit much. So basically, just find one online, find a free one, or whatever one you have at hand, and dip in and poke about and see what the text is like, and that'll be fine.
And and already, one of the things we're thinking about is what we might do for another cluster. We have some possibilities, but if people have ideas, I think we'd be really happy to hear them.
Well, if any listeners want to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm, or we're on Twitter @thespouter. Show notes with links for everything that we've mentioned in this episode, and a few other links for people who are interested in more about the symposium, will be at megaphonic.fm/spouter/2. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little shows over at Megaphonic. So until next time,
I'll see you at the Spouter-Inn.